be on Zoom at the same time.
We won't be on Zoom.
Well, I think my mom's planning to be on Zoom.
Well, good evening, everyone. The technical glitch has been cleared up. I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Unity, a continuing segment of Community Faith Partners series of topical, timely, and essential conversations on race and racism and the various manifestations of it throughout our society. My name is Cal Walker, and I am honored to be your moderator this evening. At the outset, we want to acknowledge and thank our donors for making Let's Talk Unity possible. And we want to give a special thanks to Dermatology Associates of Ithaca and the Park Foundation, who help fund Community Faith Partners' Racial Justice Initiative. Our focus this evening is navigating the wave of COVID-19 anti-Asian violence. Our panel this evening is uniquely qualified to speak to this issue, and I know that you will find their experiences and their perspectives especially illuminating. Now, as we always do, we're going to start with a brief opening prayer. Father God, in the name of Jesus, we just come before you, thanking you first of all for this day. Your word declares that this is in fact the day that the Lord has made, that we should rejoice and be glad in it. And even though, Lord, we are approaching a deeply serious subject matter, we are still able to rejoice. And we just thank you, Father, for this opportunity tonight to have this very, very important conversation. We ask your blessings upon the panelists and those who are in the audience. And we commend this time unto you right now, in the name of Jesus. Amen. Well, folks, I am very, very excited to introduce our panelists for this evening. And each of them will also share their Asian names. So first, we have Dr. Josephine M. McAllister. Josie, the name that you wanted to share?
Yes, Zhu Xing Hui.
And she is an MD, FAAD dermatologist. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Dermatology, a diplomat of the American Board of Dermatology, president of the Central New York Dermatology Society, and the president of Tompkins County's Medical Society. As the founder of Dermatology Associates of Ithaca, Dr. McAllister is committed to providing excellence in dermatologic care to patients of all ages, all skin colors, and all ethnicities. She's been a panelist for Community Faith Partners' Let's Talk Unity webinar on racial reconciliation. Dr. McAllister sees her work in racial reconciliation as an extension of her calling as a physician to love one's neighbors as oneself. And as a community member and mother of a child with special needs, she seeks to build a community in which all people are welcome, valued, and given equal opportunities to contribute and to thrive. Thank you, Dr. McAllister, for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Next, we welcome Mr. Stephen Tung.
Greetings, everyone. My name in Cantonese is Tung Youngkyu.
He is an InterVarsity Campus Staff Minister for the Asian American InterVarsity Fellowship at Cornell University. Initially headed for a career in investigating human trafficking cases, he studied and graduated from New York University with a bachelor's in chemistry and a master's degree in psychology, forensic. But God called him into ministry. He has experience in the Chinese church communities as well as in 10 years in Asian American ministry. It's great to have you with us this evening, sir.
I'm glad to be here.
Next, we have Dr. Una Kim.
I'm glad to be here. My Korean name is Kim Una.
She is a professor in the Department of Physics at Cornell University, a theoretical physicist researching quantum emergent phenomena. Her past and current focus have been on the phenomena of high temperature superconductivity and topological phases. Recently, she has been pioneering the application of machine learning to the study of correlated quantum matter. She has published in Physical Review Letters, the most recognized journal published by the American Physical Society, and in more broadly reaching journals such as Nature and Science. Her research articles have been cited more than 6,200 times to date. She received an early career award from the National Science Foundation in the year 2010, and another one from the Department of Energy 3 years later in 2013. She is a fellow of the American Physical Society since 2020. Welcome, Dr. Kim. Completing our panel is Dr. Robin Ying.
Sorry, technical difficulties. I'm so glad to join you guys this evening. My Chinese name is Yingceng En.
He received his PhD in electrical and computer engineering from Cornell University last November and currently works as a design engineer at HRL Laboratories in Malibu, California, and he's a lecturer at Cornell University. Alongside his PhD work over the last 6 years, he has served as an elder at the Vineyard Church here in Ithaca, New York, embracing one of the principles of the movement's founder, which is, in the kingdom of God, everyone gets to play. I like that. He also serves as a member of the teaching team and actively engages with both the National Vineyard Justice Network and Asian American leaders in the Vineyard movement. Additionally, for the last 6 years, as volunteer staff with the Asian American University, he has helped students navigate through the pain of their ethnic journeys in order to more faithfully bring their whole authentic selves in submission to Christ. Thanks for joining us, Robin. And would you please frame our discussion for this evening, sir?
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I think we can all kind of acknowledge that race is a biological fiction, but I think we also need to recognize that it is a sociological fact. And so even though we might prefer the term ethnicity because it more accurately captures the beauty that God intended in our diversity, we can't ignore the reality and the pain of our racialized existence in a very racialized nation. Now, as the church, we are uniquely poised to make a prophetic declaration to the world that we can and will be united and unified in Christ, that the dividing walls of hostility can come down. But this can only begin by first acknowledging the existing walls that the marginalized all too clearly already see. And so from the days of the gold rush up to today, America has been sending mixed messages to immigrants, beckoning us in as cheap labor, and then complaining about how we take away American jobs. The conflicting signs of help wanted and keep out have left us as Asians and Asian Americans with only one question on our minds: whose country is this? And so tonight we're going to invite you into the stories of our pain. We'll dispel unhelpful stereotypes, and then we'll look forward together toward true justice, advocacy, and compassion.
Well, thank you very much, sir. That was excellent. And with that, we're ready to begin our conversation. Now, for our audience, please feel free to enter questions into the Q&A, as we will be entertaining those a little bit later on in tonight's segment. And certainly, please feel free to use the chat feature for comments. So with that, as I said, we're going to get right into our discussion this evening. And the first question that I'm going to pose, Stephen, I will ask you to respond to this first, and then we'll go round robin to have everyone else respond as I call you. Something that's been certainly seared in all of our consciousness lately has been the horrific shootings in the Georgia spas. What went through your mind when you first heard of that horrific incident, Stephen?
Yeah, thanks for giving us the space for that, Cal. I think for me, there was a deep sigh and a strange contradiction of, I'm of course shocked, at the same time not. The rising conversation and incidents and attacks on Asian Americans felt like this at some point was an inevitable conclusion. People have already been injured and shoved and kicked. And so it finally leading to shooting deaths seemed that at some point, yes, this this makes sense, and at the same time, a deep pain of why as well. Lots of other history is also tied into that, and I'm sure my colleagues here will also share more of that, but I'll begin with that.
Well, thank you, sir. Dr. Kim, let's move to you. How would you respond to that, please?
It was painful because I could relate to the victims as people who could have been my family members, and I know how these women work really hard to raise their family, and but also the incident, but also what followed, various leading up to it and afterwards, various attacks that people have experienced made me really think again, whose country is this and why is this not our country?
Yes, absolutely. You talk about events that preceded that, and it's really important to acknowledge that, because so many times people want to talk about, well, this pandemic is happening now, and so it is the cause for racism as we see it manifested in so many ways, when the reality is that those attitudes and prejudices and racist attitudes have been there, and the pandemic has certainly exacerbated. So the question again is, what went through your mind when you first heard of the shootings at the Georgia spas? Robin, would you respond to that, please?
Yeah, too many things went through my mind when I first heard about the shooting. But I think one of the things that most bothered me was the question that I kept hearing was it really racist? And the more I heard the question, and eventually even heard justification that, you know, he was just having a bad day, the more I just grieved the reality that, you know, these stories of, you know, men and, well, mostly women made in the image of God, their stories have been falling far behind in the media as compared to, you know, this narrative of this one white man. And I think that's been kind of the common narrative that that goes throughout the nation. And so as we you know, read the news and heard more and more about the incident, it was more and more about the white man than it was about the actual victims. And I think that's what really hit me hard as the most tragic part of the story.
There's no question that that absolutely exacerbates the pain and the anguish and the despair that so many times we as members, when I say we, I'm talking about the various demographics of people who grossly disproportionately experience the ugliness of race and racism. The fact that they're often, the focus tends not so much to be on the victim, but to looking at the perpetrator. And often there are things of whether, you know, there were mental problems and there was this and there was that. And so having a bad day, I mean, really. Dr. McAllister, your turn.
Well, my first thought as a physician was, not again. How many mass shootings does our country have to endure before action is taken to save irreplaceable human life? As Georgia State Senator Michelle Au comments, it's easier to buy a gun here than it is to vote. Every minute that our nation is unable to enact comprehensive nationwide gun safety measures puts valuable human life at risk. My second thought as an Asian woman was, Lord, how much longer must we, a people that has already survived war, displacement, racial trauma, extreme self-sacrifice, how long must we continue to endure anti-Asian sentiment leading to words and actions that re-traumatize and even terrorize us? News commentators and law enforcement added insult to injury by widely amplifying the killer's denial that his attack was racially motivated. It reminded me of the observations of Sabrina Fulton, mother of Trayvon Martin, that in this country, an innocent person can be killed and people would step up to defend the killer. I reflected on the times that I myself looked down on other Asians for having darker skin, for speaking languages I didn't understand, for being poor, and I realized how wrong and unfair this was, and I wanted to change. For weeks after the shootings, I experienced excruciating and at times incapacitating neck and shoulder pain from the stress and grief. I was afraid to leave my home and my office. Thankfully, the Sunday right after the shootings, we actually were able to celebrate the arrival of an adorable new baby in our Down syndrome support group. And my church also hosted a pastoral discussion on anti-Asian violence. So although I was working through a fog of hurt and fear, my heart was encouraged and sustained by members of our community, the real people in our everyday lives who surround us with goodness, love, and hope. Staying silent doesn't work. Eating the bitterness of our experiences doesn't work. Only love, only holding on to faith, only obedience to do the good that we're called to do every day helps us to stay on the right path forward. And that desire to serve is why I'm here today.
Yes, and the sentiments that you've just expressed, I'm sure will be amplified throughout our conversation this evening. The next question I want to pose, starting with you, Dr. Kim, is how have you personally experienced anti-Asian racism both prior to and during this current pandemic?
Since pandemic, I've been essentially staying at home. So I haven't had much experience interacting with people, but this was a couple of years ago. I was at at YMCA with my children, and my daughter has a disability, which is not exactly visible. You have to see her not being able to stand up on her own to see that she needs stand bar and special facilities. We were using the special change room, and there was a gentleman who came up to me and said, immigrant women like you who do not understand rules in this country ruin this. And this is America. In America, we follow the rules. And I was dumbfounded. I didn't know what to say. I am usually someone who has strong opinions and I don't have difficulty sounding smart. But at that moment, I was just so shocked. I didn't know how to respond. And I was so upset that I wasn't able to actually speak up afterwards. But when at that moment I realized to his eyes, I was just rule ignoring Asian women, whatever typical view that he had. He didn't realize I am a professor in the building where he works as a staff. Recently, actually, when I went to get vaccinated and when I put out my Cornell ID and my insurance card, the person at the pharmacy asked me, "Oh, are you a staff at Cornell?" And I stopped and thought, if it was a white male with beard and gray hair, would this person have asked, "Are you a staff at Cornell?" So there is I sense that there is stereotype that people associate with me when they see me without me wearing a gigantic badge saying I'm a professor at Cornell in physics department. And that was my experience. And I realized that I'm actually very small and very weak, very vulnerable, because what people see is my external appearance, small Asian woman.
Oh, thank you for sharing. Stephen, how have you personally experienced anti-Asian racism both prior to and during the pandemic?
Yeah, part of me, as I was thinking about my response, was before the pandemic, and I laugh inwardly about this, was that my experience of racism was mild. And to think like, oh yeah, we're at the point where you can experience racism both mild or extreme. But just growing and like, oh yeah, it's nothing. No, I think a story that particularly comes up was I lived in New York City before I moved up here. And so one time as I was entering a facility to use for a sport practice. Someone yelled, a colleague actually, whom I got to practice many times with, just yelled like Asian invasion. And I looked around and I was coming in with someone else I didn't know who was also Asian, and I was confused. And I was like, he's not talking about me, is he? Because surely he's not. I was born in this country. I speak English. I'm used to all the American cultural experiences there is. I'm not invading anything. Aren't I also too, like him, an American here? And that first incident communicated to me, like, you don't belong here fully. As born and raised here, you are, you're different. That later on, he also came up to me for math problems. And at the time, I just thought that he was, not that smart, it's like needed help. And it wasn't until years later, looking back, I realized what was going on in the stereotyping of who I am and therefore what I'm supposed to know and my belonging was all tied up into that treatment. During the pandemic, I too had Dr. Kim had the privilege of being able to work safely from home. And so human contact very much so decreased dramatically. But I was still nonetheless affected because my family still lived in New York City. And when I went for a visit, I would hear the stories about their friends and their some of their church members experiencing cancellations on their Uber and taxi pickups, and people admitting that they would speed through Chinatown, not wanting to pick up any passengers or canceling on them once they saw the name of who their passenger was, an Asian name. I would hear the stories of violence. And this felt like the circle was closing in as I heard, again, friends who I was talking to an alum asking how she was, and she was working from Virginia. And she said that her colleagues back in California in the South Bay, where there has been an Asian community there for more than 100 years, and her colleagues were experiencing attacks and slurs and were scared to walk around. I even thought about when the release about the man who attacked a Filipino woman on her way to church, pushing her and kicking her. I began to fear for my grandmother who lived in New York City as well. The reality was impacting me. Some of my friends would, as they were walking, would share on Facebook, they were just walking and a man came out of nowhere, pushed a woman and saw an Asian elderly woman, heard her head hit the concrete, and she called police, and this happened to her, experiencing that. Another friend as well was in the subway and saw someone began to slowly creep up on this Asian elderly woman, and he, being a larger Asian male, stepped in between, and then the man walked away, and the Asian elderly woman turned to her and just whispered, "Thank you." These things are happening to many of our friends and family and stories, and the fear that spreads is real, and it is impacting many of us. My parents, I guess the last just quick story too, are definitely impacted. They themselves live in, not in the city, but in New Jersey, but it's impacted their behavior as well, as they went to get the vaccine. And my mother was still recovering from a form of sickness at the time. And my father dropped her off and was going to go look for a parking spot. And she said that she would wait for him there. And he said, "Actually, you should go in because people have been attacking Asians, right?" And so she was like, "Oh, you're right," and walked in. The fear and the caution is real because we know these things are happening. And that's how, even if we ourselves have personally experienced attack, we are nonetheless impacted because we know and encounter that fear.
I'm curious, Stephen, has your awareness of these types of attitudes throughout society that we're seeing manifesting in myriad ways these days, has it just come into consciousness or awareness for you personally just over the course of the last so-called pandemic year?
I think that's the awareness of these attacks not only increased, I began to learn in my own history and my own part of the Asian American history behind it. These attacks, I saw someone ask, is it new? It's not new in a way. Ever since like the 1800s, there's been like lynchings. There's a mass lynching when a group of mob went to Chinatown and lynched several Chinese people there. There was a murder of a Chinese worker in Michigan long ago. His name is Vincent Chin, and some automobile workers were frustrated that the Japanese auto industry was doing better, and so they lashed out on him, assuming just because of his look that he must be a Japanese and so was somehow responsible for them threatening of their jobs. Most of this time, I think that the incidents fly under the radar. I guess one in particular, I'll share this story. In Chinatown, during holidays, of course, families would gather together. And what happened was that there will be Asian elderly, just walking to their families, and they would be robbed, punched, and attacked. And so the Chinese community in these cities had to change when they celebrated holidays. You either go to their families the week before or the week after in order to avoid being robbed and assaulted. My grandfather being one of them. And so I think these attacks have been happening. I think they have definitely been increased as a result of the pandemic. Encouraged by rhetoric and feeling that there's no accountability as well. And so there, just want to say it does exist. And I think in many ways, the pandemic has not only raised the visibility, but actually has increased the number of them happening.
Yeah. Stephen, thank you so much for sharing those deeply personal reflections and remembrances and experiences in your life. Josie, I want to pose this question to you. How have you personally experienced anti-Asian racism before and during the pandemic?
Well, my experiences are probably too numerous to recount every one. They've happened when I was a girl and now as an adult in everyday places that should have been safe, whether I'm alone or with my children or with my parents, where people of various genders, ethnicities, and ages, including children, have verbally menaced, mocked, and harassed me with made-up sounds or Asian words. It causes indescribable heartache and self-doubt and fear. I remember strolling through the mall here on a rare afternoon off, minding my own business, and finding myself suddenly surrounded by a crowd of hooting school children, shouting a Chinese phrase at me from all directions. Who taught these children to think that Chinese people and our language are funny? Why did they think it was okay to target me? I quickly hurried off and gave up shopping for the day, and afterward have wondered on many occasions what I could have done differently. I know now that it wasn't my responsibility to educate these children in that moment, that it's the responsibility of the harasser not to assault others, and that bystanders could have decided to help by stepping up to ask the children to stop shouting at me, or even just asking me afterward if I was okay. Following such encounters, we may look okay on the outside, but inside our hearts are torn and bleeding. Microaggressions compound these wounds. It's been common for people, particularly older white men, to ask me where I'm really from after I've told them I grew up in Boston. They make it clear that I don't fit their conception of people who belong here. When people stop to ask me directions, they're first asking loudly, "Do you speak English?" Makes me wonder if I should take the time to inform them of my perfect verbal SAT score. While watching a Justin Timberlake movie, it's jarring to suddenly hear a term like Chinese fire drill. And even when simply planning a work party, someone might suggest doing a Chinese gift exchange. And I have to make a decision about whether I let it go or take a deep breath and explain that since the 1600s, Western culture calling things Chinese that are not Chinese at all has been used to denote incompetence, fraudulence, and disorganization. While attending Bible study, I've been shocked to see the face of racist bully Rush Limbaugh staring out at me from a coffee table book. And when Prince Philip died, obituaries gratuitously and repeatedly recounted his infamous mockery of Asian eyelid shape. Closer to home, mischaracterizations of me by some of my own medical colleagues have played into the stereotype of the deceitful and domineering dragon lady, a product of Hollywood fiction since the 1920s, empowering some to castigate me publicly at medical society meetings, engage in name calling over professional correspondence, and cutting me off in meetings with a dismissive Josie, while my white male physician colleagues are given the respect and peace they need to carry out their work without harassment. As a society, in person and online, we need to think about the weapons we're placing into the hands of bullies who will turn words into oppressive actions. Everyone is entitled to their opinion. However, no one should have the power to take away anyone else's freedom to live and to fully thrive and to serve our community to the very best of our ability.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much for your transparency and the reflections that you've shared. And Robin, would you be so kind, sir, as to share your experiences?
Yeah, so when I first kind of started thinking about race and ethnicity and processing that with Jesus, I came to this kind of startling realization that kind of like what Stephen shared, right? My experiences have been rather mild. And then the more that I reflected on this, the more I actually realized that this was more of my own doing than anything else. So I'm going to give a little bit of context, but I think that amongst Asians and Asian Americans, there is a history of self-silencing. And so because our culture values peace, and all too often that's really actually the semblance of peace and not any true peace. But because of this, we're taught either explicitly or even implicitly not to push against the status quo, not to disturb the peace, and certainly don't express your individualism. And so if we're taught to not express who we are or what we feel in our homes, we're in effect trained to suffer in silence outside of them. And so I like to summarize my experience of racism as the acceptance of exploitation in order to belong. Because I grew up in a predominantly white town neighborhood, and though I did have Asian American friends, they were, 5th, 6th, 7th generation Chinese and Japanese Americans. They didn't speak a lick of their native tongue. And so I found myself quickly kind of denying the more Chinese or Taiwanese, I guess, aspects of myself in order to not only assimilate, but actually, desperately cling to acceptance. And so I'll share a really important story, basically my testimony, where all throughout middle school, I was kind of like this token smart Asian friend amongst a group of what I believe now very clearly to have been the popular folk. And I didn't know for a long time, but I was simply just being used. I didn't know that they weren't actually my friends, but that they were using me in order to, cheat on tests and do their homework. I thought I was just being, friendly, helpful, etc. And so the more I thought about this and processed this with Jesus, the more I realized that I had so desperately wanted to belong that I had given over, myself, right? My authentic self had been put to death or, in some ways violated, right? In order to belong. And so one day in 7th grade, it was one of my friends, air quote, birthdays, at which point he then said that, I wasn't invited to this birthday party. And then he told me that that they had just been using me all along. And so this is a very scarring moment, but this is also really critical to why I, found Christ, right? Because not long after this whole incident and just kind of being emotionally scarred, not wanting to be, vulnerable or even approach new people, new faces. I'm unable to trust anyone who came along seeking to be my friend. Eventually, these couple of classmates just were so persistent and so annoying in some ways, but they were so generous and so giving of their time. And I started to realize that they didn't actually want anything from me in return. And so as a result, I actually started to let down my walls and trust them. And we ultimately did become friends. And as a result, I did end up going to this youth group, learning about Jesus, studying the Bible. And the more and more I saw kind of this loving, caring, welcoming, not even just attitude or behavior, but complete, value that these people lived out, the more I was compelled to learn more about who Jesus was. And so as I started going to this youth group, I was actually in the process of healing from this very traumatic experience. And I also then began to start to accept and realize, that being true to myself is more important than being accepted. And even more than that, that Jesus accepts me and accepts everyone just as they are. And so, a lot of my experience of racism was really just the acceptance of being exploited in order to belong.
Wow, I just thank you all so much for your transparency and sharing the things that you did. Now, Robin, did you use the term self-silencing kind of in order to get along? Was that the term, self-silencing?
Yeah.
Okay, let me ask you, and others as well, is that, would you call that an Asian cultural norm to some extent?
I think it depends. I think that it's either self-silencing or you are being silenced. So I think I was going to get to this a little bit later, but I've had the privilege of being, a leader in a church where I've been given not only a platform and a place of authority, not as a token Asian, but with, the ability to actually push, to actually have uncomfortable conversations. Where I think more often than not, with other leaders that I've met in various different spaces, including other Asian American leaders in the Vineyard Network, where, if they're one of a very few, it's very often found that in their experiences, they're not taken seriously, or their thoughts are considered too disruptive, right? Too different and not the norm, whether in the church or in business. And so, I think it's both either self-silencing or otherwise being silenced by others.
So here's what I'm going to do as moderator. I'm going to, as they say, put a pin in that, because I want to circle back around to it after a couple other questions. And where I want to go with that, just so it can be in the back of your minds, is this: to the extent that this self-silencing in order to get along, and does that contribute in part to what I'm sure you've all heard referred to as Asians as the model minority? I'd be really interested in probing that a little bit, but we're going to move on to a couple other questions right now. If and time permitting, we'll circle back to that question. So I want to pose this question: how might we, the audience that is tuned in tonight, how might we be racist toward Asians without, or at least claiming not to realize it? So I'm going to pose that question, and Josie and Stephen and Dr. Kim, and then Robin, in that order.
Thank you, Cal. And Robin, thank you so much for that thoughtful answer and for sharing your testimony. So, we've all grown up swimming with this vast tide of white preference and of internal stereotypes that diminish or dehumanize Asians in ways that we or white children or parents might not even notice anymore. So for example, on a personal level, if you have an automatic ew response to Asian food, It might be helpful to reflect on where that comes from, how much might come from lack of exposure, or perhaps influenced by preference for all aspects of Western culture, including food. So my sister and I grew up being bullied for the handmade dumplings that my mom lovingly made for our school lunches. And we insisted that she pack a peanut butter and jelly sandwich inside a small brown paper bag so we wouldn't be harassed for eating at school. But just think, there could have been young future chefs, young future world travelers among our schoolmates who would have benefited from seeing new food, learning to try something new, maybe even learning a few food names in Chinese. Thankfully, my girls' school actually has this no yuck to my yum lunch policy that really helps to establish a culture of respect. On a personal and also systemic level, if an Asian person in your organization, and Robin, I think this speaks a little bit to what you were getting at, if an Asian person is pointing out an area needing improvement, first of all, just realize it's taken them they've really had to overcome a lot of self-doubt and self-silencing to say a little something. And if you're in your leadership's automatic responses to diminish or dismiss their concerns, stop and ask whether this response is coming from a stereotype of Asians needing to remain quiet, uncomplaining, and subservient. In Christian organizations, we're called to love one another, and in any organization, we ought to value every human being. And that means they're fully autonomous human selves, not someone else's stereotype of a model minority that accepts second-class citizen status with a smile. In a predominantly white institution, I've seen a race and justice committee finally formed in urgent response to the racism we all felt called to fight together. And just as quickly, the committee melted away as a white person in senior leadership took strong offense at our suggestion that things might need to change and insisted on adding an outspoken racism denier onto the committee. It was a lost opportunity for that institution to learn how to welcome people of all ethnic backgrounds, to stay relevant, and perhaps even grow its next generation of young leaders. I've also witnessed discussions of racial justice veer off track into re-traumatization of minorities who finally collected a little courage to come share our stories and our broken hearts, only to be quashed by anger and defensive emotional outbursts and even name calling from some in the majority. For example, socialist is an interesting name to call someone whose family left everything to escape and reject communism. What a lost opportunity to show love and compassion, and again, to learn and grow and work together on the same level to lift up our institutions and country that are consistent with our stated value of all being created equal. Incidentally, experiences like those help me to really appreciate everyone listening and joining in on this webinar today. You are all miracles, and I am so grateful for you. Just to be listened to is so healing. And on a professional level, the next time you find yourself frustrated during interactions with an Asian person who you may perceive to be evasive, dragging their feet, or insincere, stop and ask yourself whether you're fully understanding everything that they're trying to communicate to you. Asian cultures are so-called high context, meaning there's a lot conveyed in between what is stated out loud, so-called reading the air. I've been in meetings where two sides came to completely opposite conclusions about what was agreed on, because one side was doing so much talking that they completely missed multiple cues coming from the other side. Ask clarifying questions, use it as a learning opportunity to observe and listen to all the cues. That's something we all need to work on in this day of being masked most of the time at work. And understand this communication style, including avoidance of direct eye contact, is meant to convey honor and respect toward you. On a heart level, if you see Asians and immigrants succeeding and thriving, and you feel a twinge of resentment, it may be helpful to reflect on how the model minority myth ignores the real life struggles of many Asian nationalities. It puts debilitating pressure on young people, and it was actually created to divide us. Instead of blindly accepting zero-sum thinking, which teaches that one group's success takes away from someone else's, let's look at the positive sum reality of immigrants who actually over the long run serve as makers and not takers, who start businesses and create jobs, and whose contributions help to keep Social Security solvent, drive innovation, boost demand for local goods, at least when they feel empowered to leave their homes, and boost wages for American workers. Let's celebrate one another's accomplishments and build a culture of excellence in which everyone has equal opportunity to provide our best for the good of our entire community. So Cal, I think it really is helpful for all of us to try and reflect, take every moment when these issues come up to be able to look inside of ourselves.
Wow, very detailed response. Thank you so very much. I still want to offer others the opportunity, if you like to respond to that question of how we, the audience, the folks who are tuning in, might be racist toward Asians without consciously realizing it. Stephen, if you'd like to respond, or Dr. Kim.
Josie said so much, and there's so much gold and treasure there. Thank you so much, Josie. I'm not going to add a whole lot. I'll just add like maybe one or two small nuggets into that already vast treasure that Josie has gifted all of us. Something that I think would maybe helpful for some people to know is I know when some people have asked, like, where are you really from? Some people are trying to ask about our ethnic culture and notice our diversity. And so it just wants to ask, what's your ethnic background? But asking the question where you're really from conveys that we are foreigners still. Even though I may be born in this country, my family has been here for years. And so just knowing how, maybe if you're curious, honestly curious, being able to change, instead ask, what's your ethnic background? That is a much better question. And I think many would be open to answering that. Also, after, if they feel safe enough to tell you what's their ethnic background, please don't try to use them for language practice. I've had many people who have, after learning I'm Chinese, say, oh, ni hao. And they mean that well. I am a Cantonese, which is a certain part of Chinese from around the southern area of China. And so I don't speak Mandarin, which is where ni hao comes from. There are even different languages within the same country. And so by saying that to me, you're also assuming a lot from me that I know. I must have grown up in another country, maybe, to know another different language. I don't know. And so you would never go up to one of your friends and after finding out they are German, say, Guten Tag, and try to speak with them in German. After you build trust, maybe you can ask about their language, but please don't assume. I will just leave that small piece for there and leave room for Dr. Kim and Robin.
Yes, Dr. Kim, would you like to respond, please?
So I've seen discussions about race in my children's school curriculum, and I have often found how anything to do with race is often, it becomes an issue of who's innocent and who's offender. And when you are deemed an offender, you naturally become defensive because nobody likes to think that they're in the wrongs. So actually, I want to turn the table around and reflect on myself. When I caught myself showing bias, that I caught myself. And in the end, I want to say that we can look for what we are more alike than how we're different. So recently, I was interviewing a candidate, and her English wasn't very fluent. She had a strong accent, and it took extra effort to understand what she was trying to say. And I just realized, because it was taking extra effort, my mindset was already put to a different gear. I wasn't taking her seriously. I was code switching. I was putting on the position of, just because my English is a little more fluent than her English is, I was already discounting her as, oh, another person who doesn't speak her English. And then I caught myself, and I was able to see through that exterior and realize actually she has brilliant ideas. She's brave. She's creative. She have innovative and ambitious plans. But if I didn't catch myself, I wouldn't have seen this. And I realized to go beyond what you see superficially takes intellectual effort, extra energy, which often we don't seem to have to spare. But putting in that extra effort makes us more advanced compared to lesser animals, I believe. We're not lizards for having the part of brain that is capable of doing this. So I want us to see more in common. I was recently studying Cayuga Nation and the history of First Nation natives culture in the region. And I saw a picture of elderly people of Cayuga Nations, and I was surprised to see how similar they looked to some elderly people that I would have imagined in countryside in Korea. So people who lived here much longer than most of us actually look a lot like me. You know? So I think we can actually see beyond our superficialness, because if you start to divide, you can divide Asian into Southeastern Asian, you know, Far East Asian. You can divide Far East Asian into Japanese, Chinese, Cantonese, Mandarin, you know, Taiwanese, Korean, and even in Korea, tiny country, have different regions, you know, we have different dialects. You can divide forever and start excluding other people for being different from you. Or you can choose to see where you are similar, how you are similar. I think when we can see how we are actually more like each other, and when we can see each of us as full human with their full history, everybody came to this country from somewhere, just a small 50, 100-year difference. Korean history goes back 5,000 years, or so I was taught when I was growing up. From that perspective, 100 years seems very short to be, you know, dividing and excluding each other. So I would like to plead everyone to try to see what's more alike and see beyond what superficially make you feel a little uncomfortable, little unusual.
Well, Dr. Kim, thank you so much for sharing that. So transparent, the example that you shared, and the very reflective and insightful thoughts that you've shared. And I hope that all of us in the audience feel challenged and willing to rise to the challenge that you're putting forth in terms of being able to see one another as you know, beyond stereotypes and things like this, because we're all made in the image of God and all of inestimable value in God's sight. So thank you very much for sharing that. Really appreciate it. Robin, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to that question. How might we, as a society in general, how might particularly those of us who are tuned in tonight be exhibiting racist behaviors and stereotypes toward Asians without conscious awareness?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say, yeah, everyone else on this panel has hit it spot on. But I'll speak to one more point really briefly, which is that I think that there are a lot of things that are done or said that make Asians and Asian Americans feel invisible or unseen. And an example is just the debate that happened, right, between whether or not this attack in Atlanta was racially motivated. It really just didn't matter to Asian Americans because they were a people who were in pain. And so the fact that you're debating whether or not it was a racially motivated attack makes the pain that many people were experiencing completely invalid, invisible, and unseen. And so I guess my caution to the church in particular is that this invitation to reconcile without seeking Christ-like justice, or to put aside bitterness without grieving pain, or to heal or seek healing without corporate acknowledgement of the hurt and injustice isn't an invitation that you should be making or that we should be accepting. And the church does this in the name of unity, but in reality, what we're doing is denying the painful experiences that people need to bring before Jesus in order to be healed.
Yes, amen. Thank you. Wow. I'm going to pose one additional question, and then we're going to make time for responding to some of the questions from the audience. And I want to remind the audience again that please feel free to place your questions in the Q&A. We have someone monitoring that, and will be feeding them to me, and we're going to transition to the Q&A from the audience within the next few minutes or so. But panel, one final question that I want to pose for you. And that question is just, how can we see and respond to anti-Asian racism around us? You know, the focus, you all have clearly laid out some things that we always want to challenge folks and issue a call to action, so to speak. So how can we see and respond to the anti-Asian racism around us? What can we proactively do to reduce anti-Asian racism, whether personally or in our various local initiatives? And I'm going to pose that question, Dr. Kim. I'm going to invite you to respond first, and then we will go to Robin and to Stephen and to Josie.
When you see someone who is being attacked, perhaps seeing us, I think, seeing Asians, and seeing people who are being attacked, acknowledging it instead of making them invisible is something that we can do. Maybe it's safe, and sometimes it may not be safe, but making them invisible, you know, ignoring, you know, choosing not to see them, I think is something that has to change. When a lot of people choose not to see what's happening in front of their eyes, that's what I want to add.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Stephen. And if anybody needs me to repeat the question, please let me know.
Yes, thank you, Cal. And thank you, Dr. Yuna. I think one thing that our churches can do is it's begin the transformation and attitude in ourselves. And I'm sure my other colleagues will give other even policy or actionable steps. But for something I think in our churches that we can do, just to start that off, is to see the Asians in your community, if there are any, and name your appreciation for them, and name the strengths and the way you've seen them contribute. Pay attention to them in that way. Recognition for their effort and for their presence goes a long way. And so if you don't know if there are perhaps no Asian members at your church, even a very friendly hellos in public as you walk by goes a long way as well. Allows them to know that not only they're seen, they're welcomed. If they don't respond or don't give eye contact, please don't take it personally. They're simply trying to, they may feel like, surely they couldn't have said that to me. And so it may take some time, or they are a bit shy, but it does go a long way. And so small actions like that for ourselves and our churches would be a great place to start.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Robin, how would you respond to that question, sir?
Yeah, I'll try to keep this brief, but I think kind of thinking even back to the shooting in Atlanta, one of the responses that I started to see on Facebook, as well as with friends in Georgia, is that there was this increasing tension and actual developing hatred between Black America and Asian America. Because why did the Asian shooting incident get all this media attention when every day and all the time Black brothers and sisters in Christ are being killed, right? And so I think that reminds me of this silly expression that my wife and I heard on TV one day, which is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think this actually captures the sentiment of America. In fact, it's our very history and our founding, where there was this role reversal of the oppressed, right? Those oppressed in Britain, in England, were being we're seeking kind of escape from the oppression. And in result, in the Americas, they became the oppressor, if for no other reason than to never be oppressed again. And I think that there's this sense of be oppressed or be the oppressor. You have only those two choices. And I think that the invitation that Christ beckons us to is that if we really want to move forward in true unity, the way that Christ calls us and compels us to, we actually have to bring everyone to the table, and not just bring everyone to the table, but make sure that each story and each voice is heard. And so privilege, right? It's invisible to those who have it, but it is the leveraging of power for those who wield it on behalf of others. And you can either choose to leverage your power, your platform, your voice in order to preserve and protect your power, yourself, your people, or we can actually leverage those same things in order to advocate for the unheard and the unseen. And so, yeah, I'm just encouraged that at least in my church, right, we've tasted this. My wife as a worship leader, myself as an elder, even though we do things differently and we challenge the status quo, we are being accepted as we bring our authentic selves in our leadership and in our worship. And so I would encourage you to consider what that might look like in your context, whether that's a church, a business, or anything else.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Josie, and you have the opportunity to respond to that as well. Share your thoughts, please.
Thank you. So in terms of what we can do to proactively reduce anti-Asian racism, one really powerful thing we can do is just rethink what we're consuming, what we're supporting, or even what we're showing to our children. So research shows that by the age of 3, children begin to form racial biases. By the age of 7, these biases can actually become fixed. There are plentiful images of white heroes of their own stories doing all kinds of amazing things, contrasted with stereotyped, negatively depicted, or laughable, many fewer people of color doing many fewer things. These images may be disseminated across the world and create lifelong impressions, hurt, and barriers. There are also news organizations and websites and even politicians who regularly platform hate speech, denigrating and scapegoating immigrants. And as a society, we should think about how to effectively hold them accountable, or at least not provide them with support when their power is misused to harm our neighbors. How Asians are portrayed by others can determine how we are treated in the streets. Also, if you're a member of an organization, encourage your organization to recruit and support a diverse leadership. Robin was talking about this. It needs to actually empower and not just tokenize Asians. I've seen some short-sighted decisions made by boards comprised of all one gender, all one race, all with the same blind spots. If a minority woman had a true voice on those bodies, maybe their organizations could have avoided making very expensive self-destructive mistakes. Studies show that diverse leadership teams boost innovation and financial performance and allow you to welcome more people in to help your team thrive and grow and carry out its mission more effectively now and for future generations. If you're a teacher or a parent, use teachable moments to help children rethink their assumptions about which ethnicities they find to be funny or dirty or foreign and why. A relevant lesson right now could be to teach about why the WHO guidance instructs us not to name viruses after geographic locations, since it can lead to stigma, backlash, barriers to travel and trade, and harm people's lives and livelihoods. For example, the swine flu was not named for any of the 4 US states in which it originated. The Ithaca Asian American Association has actually launched a great campaign called Virus Has No Nationality, complete with adorable stickers and posters that can be displayed in your school or organization. You can join our celebration of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month in May, which recognizes and honors the many contributions of over 20 million of our fellow Americans of Asian and Pacific Islander descent, who contributed vitally to the history, culture, and achievements of the United States. On a local note, let Ithaca Murals know that we'd love to see their proposed mural celebrating the artistic contributions of Asians right here in our own college town at the Dryden Street parking garage. And as Una mentioned, as a bystander, if you see something, please just take a minute out of your day. You don't have to be a hero, just like the Good Samaritan. He was just a regular person. All it takes is for you to be the one. Don't risk your safety, but think about whether there's anything you can do. You can maybe support the victim, ask if they're okay when there's a safe moment, help to call for help if that would help them, maybe distract the harasser, just like Stephen's friend did. And if you don't know how to intervene, I encourage you to take a Zoom bystander training course with Hollaback. So we'll have this on our resources page for the video of this recording. On May 20 and 24th, the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights and Ithaca Asian American Association will hold a facilitated Zoom discussion for half an hour after each of those Hollaback trainings. So again, that's on May 20 and 24. Also, as a community member, please help to support the many Asian-owned businesses in our community. We have almost 20% Asian Americans here in the Ithaca community locally. Many have been hard hit by the pandemic and would really appreciate the opportunity for support and to be able to serve you. If you're a member of a faith-based organization, you can also see if there's any exclusion perpetuated by your belief system or your institution. Are women and minorities represented in senior leadership? And if not, why? Are people telling you that social justice shouldn't be taught as part of your faith tradition? I encourage you to read your own religious texts again with open eyes, mind, and heart. I recently found the word equity from my faith tradition in Psalm 98 in the Bible, where it says, "Sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done marvelous things. He has remembered his love. All the ends of the earth have seen the salvation of our God. Let the sea resound and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. Let the rivers clap their hands. Let the mountains sing together for joy. Let them sing before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples with equity." Wow, it's in there. I'd never seen it before until my heart grew big enough that I could see and appreciate it. And finally, as everyone is doing by being here tonight, continue to build cross-cultural relationships and support initiatives, such as tonight's program, that break down the barriers of racism that divide us. In addition to Let's Talk Unity webinars like these, Community Faith Partners also hosts book clubs, such as the one in May that's coming up. Author Sheila Wise-Rowe will join us to discuss her groundbreaking book, Healing Racial Trauma, The Road to Resilience. So this is one of the many resources that we'll actually be posting on YouTube, on the Community Faith Partners YouTube channel to go with this video. And please share with your friends. If there's anything that you've learned tonight that you think they would benefit from, please let them know.
Well, Joseph, thank you so much for sharing those specific resources, and we will reiterate again before we close out tonight where those resources can be accessed. I want to remind the audience again that we are taking questions to pass along to the panelists. And don't be shy about putting your questions in the Q&A. We do have a question that is posed. It's a two-parter. I'm going to ask part one first and invite any of our four panelists to respond to it. And here's the question. Is violence against Asian Americans on the rise, or has it been a constant problem? Robin, let me ask you first, sir.
it's certainly been a constant problem. If we go back just, Gold Rush, Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese internment camps, it's certainly not new. I think it just points to the fact that, Asians and Asian Americans have, in some ways or others, chosen either to self-silence and to kind of sit in their pain without vocalizing it. But I think that, a time is coming now where people are learning to raise their voice. And so I think that's why we're hearing more. In fact, I think every day, there are different incidents and tragedies that are happening that we just never know about or hear about. But it's certainly not anything new. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And some of you actually spoke to that a little earlier, and we never know when, at what point some of our guests come on. And so I wanted to go ahead and pose that question. And thank you, sir, for responding. If any of the rest of you would like to respond to that, you certainly may. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and pose part 2 of that question. And part 2 says, ask this: is violence against, is this violence directed against a particular Asian group or from a particular Asian country? And the questioner goes on to say, it really shouldn't matter, but he or she is just wondering if this is being tracked and are there any trends? Anyone have a perspective on that or a response?
Well, go ahead, Josie.
Oh, I was just going to say, so when there are reports of what the attacker is saying, often it's specifically anti-Chinese sentiment.
Okay. Yeah, I'll add and give context that perhaps some of our listeners may recognition that, again, Asian American covers a very large spectrum of diversity.
Yes.
And so I would say that people who in our country, again, racialized, not meaning the specific ethnicity of Cantonese, Taiwanese, or Korean, but who look East Asian are attacked as a result of just the size our society, just peering through our facial structures of race and phenotypes that happens with that. And so I would say a lot of East Asians face increased violence.
Thank you. Other responses to that question? Another one just came in that I am happy to pose. All right, I will go on. Robin, you mentioned that there's been some divide between the Black and Asian communities. Is there a historical divide between Blacks and Asians? And it's posed to Robin, but certainly any of you, please feel free to respond to that.
Historical. So I don't know if I have a great answer, but I will say that from the moment of the Tower of Babel and kind of the diaspora, right, of nations being formed and people groups kind of clustering together, I think that what you tend to see is that there are different stereotypes that have developed to try to put these different ethnic groups at odds with each other. Again, kind of going back to what I mentioned before, we have a choice of whether we're going to kind of play into that increased division and tension. But I think part of why this conversation today is helpful and important is that we can actually hear the different stories and understand that there is much more to being Asian American than the model minority myth. And so I think people, the media, and I don't know who people I mean here, but culture as a whole, I think, tries to put different ethnic groups at odds. And in some ways, I don't know if I would say this completely truly, but the majority culture, right, white America, probably benefits from the fact that Asians and Blacks are going to go at each other rather than work together to rise up as the minority culture in order to together collectively have a voice.
Absolutely. I see some heads nodding. Josie, Dr. Kim, Stephen, do you have anything to add to that?
That's great to keep in mind, you know, whatever is being directed your way, just remember, don't let them divide us.
Yeah, I like the phrase the enemy. I will share a quick story of when my grandparents moved into New York City project housing. They definitely faced a lot of anger toward the Black community there because of the way that they have been at times robbed and beaten and teased at. But the enemy is not each other. The enemy is the lie that the other person is taking away your job, the lie that the other person is gonna replace you, the lie that they are a danger to you. And that's the lie that Jesus came to defeat and defeated the dividing wall of hostility to bring all people to himself. And so I think that in our countries, the future is what Jesus is doing. And so there in history, yes, there has been moments of conflict between the two groups because of their proximity to each other. But I also just want to point out there's also moments of solidarity as well. A quick Google will find that Frederick Douglass, the legendary civil rights icon around the time of Abraham Lincoln, advocated for Chinese and Japanese immigration when people sought to block them from entering the country. During the Filipino-American War, Black leaders and soldiers opposed colonizing and moving into the families. Civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. protested against Vietnam War and had said that Black men should fight racism, not Vietnamese freedom fighters. So there's lots of points of solidarity as well as tension in our nation's history.
Thank you. Very insightful. Does anyone else want to speak to that particular question or issue? Another question. I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Kim.
So when I was a second grader, my family was visiting Golden, Colorado, and I entered school. I was the only Asian in the entire school. It was predominantly white school. And one day at lunchtime, and I didn't speak a word of English. One day at a lunchtime, a boy came to me and poured a cup of milk, his entire thing of milk on my skirt. I didn't understand what he said because I didn't speak the language. But I could feel what that was. Now, this boy was a boy who was being bullied. I think he was Latin American. He had a dark skin. He was also unique, and he was somebody who was being bullied. And he took it out on me, who was a newcomer, who he felt was someone he can bully on. What would have been better was, it was not right that he was being bullied, and it was not right for him to bully me. And maybe the tension and conflict comes from both groups being minority, perhaps only contending that minority spot and feeling that's a zero-sum game, rather than understanding that this country is all of our country. We don't have to fight for that corner. We actually have right to this entire country. And we can rise together and we can grow together. So that was kind of as a second grader, I felt this, and it left a deep impression on me that it shows that racism does not require words to condemn someone, right? Yeah, just wanted to share that.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. It's way back in second grade, you said, huh? Wow.
Yeah, this was in 80s. And my position was coming from a very poor developing country. And I think part of the self-silencing comes from like first generation immigrants fled wars. They came for their dear life and they were just grateful to live. And perhaps they felt like that was enough, being able to live without worrying about my life being threatened. I would just stay silent and be accepted, and that's my way to be accepted. But racism and all the stereotyping attacks have been there, just it was not spoken of. And I think the younger generation is not accepting that. And I think we shouldn't accept that.
All right, thank you so much for that. Time is drawing nigh here, and we have a couple other questions that I want to pose. This one is directed to all of you, actually, anyone who wants to speak to it. And the questioner asks, can you say more about how to disagree or offer a corrective, and I'm going to insert the word suggestion or idea, without violating the ideal of, and they put it in quotes, unity in a church setting?
I can go, I guess. I think unity does not mean uniformity. In fact, unity as it's expressed in Revelation 7 is in diversity. And so I think we have to be careful about what we're going for when we say the pursuit of unity. More often than not, I think it's an excuse to kind of maintain the status quo. And I think you also said disagree in your question, right? And I think to disagree then implies that you're at least hearing what someone else is saying. And so I think really step one is to make space for disagreement, because I've heard many times over that people love it when they can go to church and everyone loves one another and you know, it's a happy-go-lucky experience, but there's no actual discipleship or growth happening because everyone just enjoys hearing themselves echo each other, right? And so in diversity, we actually are challenged to kind of expand our view of who God is. And you know, my wife and I had the best experience visiting, or not visiting, when she was living in Philly. She was going to a Black church, and I had the best experience visiting and just really expanding my understanding of what worship is. With a people who live in a place where, you know, they do hear gunshots every night. And so I guess, you know, to disagree and to be in unity is to listen to one another's stories and to understand that one's experience of Christ can actually expand your understanding of who God is.
Yes, sir, absolutely. Robin, I'm sorry, Robin, thank you so much for that response. Stephen, Josie, Dr. Kim, would you like to add anything to what Robin has just shared? Okay. This, we will make the last question, if we can kind of address it maybe in a couple of minutes. And I think some of the things that you all have already said kind of speaks to this. And here's what the questioner asks: what are your perspectives on building relationships among churches, in particular ethnicity-based churches, in relation to today's topic?
That would be amazing. That would be so amazing. We would be so much stronger if we all worked together. And yeah, I would say let's do it. Let's start. Whoever wants to come with us.
I love your enthusiasm about that.
Yeah, actually, in response to something that Una said, I pulled this off my bookshelf, which is a really excellent book. It's called The Sum of Us. You can see a picture of the pool. She talks about the pool that racism drained in the 1960s, where with the decision that pools should be integrated, a lot of white communities decided just to drain and fill their pools, and white children were crying and Black children were crying. And if there were Asian children, I'm sure they were crying too. In those communities, and we all lose out so much as a result of the many implications of racism, and we all have so much to gain. So no matter what the struggles, no matter what the barriers, you know, Deanna Carruthers, she's our wonderful Chief Equity Officer here in Tompkins County. She came to talk to the physicians at the Medical Society, and she said, you know, the backlash is going to be more, it's going to be stronger. The more that we get to challenging these established power structures, the more viciously they're going to fight back. But don't forget, they will benefit too. Everyone gets to benefit when we can finally overcome this. And let's not leave it as a problem for our children to solve. For me and Una as mothers, you know, I know that's a deep, deep part of our motivation in being here today. and doing what work we're able to do.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to respond? Any last comments that you wish to make?
I may add something, but I just want to ask if Dr. Kim had anything to add since she was unmuted.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, I just want to make sure there's space for you. A story strikes me. I think sometimes when people think of uni events, especially between ethnic specific churches, they think, let's put us all together in one room and then throw a worship session. A story from the book Disunity in Christ by Christina Cleveland, who is a faculty and studies psychology, once shared the story of how two churches did exactly that. They wanted to do better at reconciling racial tensions, and so they threw combined church block party. And what they failed to do was communicate well. And so members from the congregation from the Black community came all dressed up and ready to attend. And members from the white community came with very casual clothes, and they all stuck to their own people throughout the whole party. Needless to say, Christina Cleveland said if she was there, she would have told the leaders that that was a bad idea. And so we can't just throw things together and expect things to happen. I think some things that would be helpful would be to, well, first pray for openness and humility and curiosity. Curiosity, humility. Curiosity to learn and to explore different styles of worship, different styles of prayer. To ask questions of, oh, what would be a kind thing to say, a loving thing to say? How can I learn to support you? And humility to be able to have grace when you make a mistake and when someone corrects you as well. Have your leaders meet beforehand, people who are influential in the church, to begin praying about these things and meeting with each other's leaders so that they can have relationships with each other's churches, and they can learn about other cultures, and they can bring back to their churches and begin preparing, because they are influencers in their churches, begin to tell people stories and prep people well on how to engage with different cultural expectations, cultural ways of worshiping, cultural ways of loving, and then perhaps bring people together.
Yes.
Those are things that come to my mind.
And thank you so much for sharing that, Stephen, because we have to be intentional about these kinds of things. We have to invest time and thought and build relationship and all of those kinds of things. And sometimes people just want to do the quick and easy thing. Let's just get everybody together. Well, if there's no groundwork and no real intentionality in relationship building and purposeful planning, it's going to fall flat. And so many times people say, well, we don't know what to do, so let's just go ahead and do this quick thing. Here's the thing, there's a saying that I share often when the context of the situation seems to support it. And here's the saying. It says that if it's important enough, we will find a way. And if it's not, we'll find an excuse. And so often, people wind up not doing something. Well, we don't know what to do, and it's just too much work, or we don't want to mess it up. But if it's important enough, and people understand relational connectivity is the foundation upon which we're going to build anything that's sustainable, then people are willing to do that hard work and to move forward. And so, listen, folks, I tell you, this has been amazing. I've been looking forward to this conversation tonight, and it has certainly not disappointed. And on behalf of Community Faith Partners, I certainly want to thank the audience for engaging with us on this timely topic, and to you, the panelists. Oh my goodness, you delivered heartfelt experiences, you heard observations and ways that we as a community and a society can, and I would emphasize must, make change and do the work of making a change purposeful, intentional, and sustainable. In fact, in John chapter 17, it details a prayer that Jesus prayed for his disciples, and the theme of that prayer is unity. Jesus told his disciples that he was praying not only for them, but also for all who follow. And Christ's desire is for us to live in community and in unity. So Community Faith Partners is committed to fostering unity and promoting racial justice and reconciliation, and mitigating violence against our Asian sisters and brothers plays an absolute key role in fostering unity and racial reconciliation. I trust that all of you who've tuned in tonight will agree, and we certainly appreciate your joining us. So Josie has alluded to some of this, and I just want to reiterate, check out the website communityfaithpartners.org and/or Community Faith Partners YouTube channel for more information and resources on tonight's topic. Also, Community Faith Partners, Let's Talk Unity team, I believe has put a survey in the chat and said that it should only take about 2 minutes to complete it. And if you can't finish it now, they can email it to you. So lastly, we want to again thank the financial donors who make this series possible. And we want to say a special thanks to Dermatology Associates of Ithaca and the Park Foundation for their sponsorship of Let's Talk Unity. So thank you all, and we wish you a good night.